Thank you.
Good. Hi, everyone. My name is Mia. I use she, her pronouns. And this is my second attempt at doing a training through Zoom. So if there are things that I'm missing or if I'm going too fast, please write it in the chat or feel free to let me know out loud. This is a super new thing for me. So I appreciate the opportunity to try this. A little bit of background about me. I come from a shelter. I've been working in sheltering for maybe 6 years, I think. But a lot of my experience is doing program management for youth ages 12 to 17. So I found as I go through this presentation, sometimes the examples and the things that I have to draw on pertain more to youth than they do to adults. So please let me know if I'm going a little bit too far with the youth examples. In March of 2020, I was one of the program leads for the physical distancing shelters with Multnomah County. So I had more experience working with adults through that. But again, my hope with this section of the training for all of us is that we can really draw on all the expertise that's already in the room. So please feel free to contribute. At the end of most of the slides, I'll be asking to see if these are things that work best for you. If there's additional learning that you have to add, the more we can kind of teamwork this, I feel like the better it will work out for all of us. Cool. Ready for the next slide. So with this section about conflict resolution, for some of our learning objectives are to learn ways to deal with conflict, understand conflict resolution goals, identify conflict resolution styles. We'll talk about some different styles and some different big picture approaches to conflict resolution, recognize and understand responses to conflict, learn conflict resolution approaches, and learn how to create space for conflict resolution to occur. We'll also be talking a little bit about anger and ways to deal with it, and looking at kind of the cycle of anger that we may experience or observe. Cool. Awesome. So conflict resolution. We're probably in this room. I see that there's people from so many different agencies and different areas, and that is my cat in the background. I apologize if you can hear the cat. I'll try to minimize this one. But I think that we all probably have experience resolving conflict in our personal lives and our work life with the clients that we're working with, but kind of the big picture idea. So conflict in its essence is a way for two or more parties to find a peaceful solution to a disagreement among them. Ideally, we want to approach conflict as an opportunity to improve the relationship between the groups in conflict. We want to identify potential solutions and work to produce a solution that everyone can agree to. Conflict resolution key skills include being open to the perspective of others, and defining the conflict as a personal need, not as only a solution. Ready for the next one. So Thomas and Kilman identified 5 conflict resolution styles. These conflict resolution styles, when I first looked at this, I was like, oh, this is like a personality test. I will be more compromising and collaborative. But instead, these conflict resolution styles are appropriate for the scenario. So all of us may use these different styles at different times, depending on the situation that we're encountering. So for example, with the first one, we have a competitive conflict resolution style. So this may be used for scenarios when quick, decisive action is important, especially emergencies. Also, maybe when your core values need to be defended, or when it's absolutely necessary for things to go your way, primarily if there's a safety concern. If used inappropriately, relationships may weaken, especially if it's perceived that you won and the other person lost. And you may receive less input and ideas from others, so that people may not buy into the solution and potentially sabotage the decision, or it's more of a superficial solution. And for example, with a competitive conflict resolution style, a scenario that comes to mind, maybe you are where you're a shift lead at a shelter and there's an emergency and two staff come to you, and one says, we need to call 911 for this guest, and the other one says, I think Multnomah County Crisis Line is more beneficial. That's who we need to call. You would look at the situation and then maybe say, I think we need to call 911 now. This is a medical emergency first, mental health emergency second. So that's taking that more competitive conflict resolution style, but you're solving the problem quickly because the situation calls for it. So the second one is collaborative. So collaborative conflict resolution style is used to find a solution that focuses on all the concerns. It's used to merge insights from individuals with different perspectives, and when the commitment and buy-in is needed to implement a solution. If this style is used inappropriately, time and energy may be wasted on issues that are not important to reaching the solution, and the longer process may frustrate some individuals. For example, in collaborative problem solving, maybe with the shelters, there's a laundry service. So maybe guests are coming to you as a manager and saying, the days of the week that are chosen for laundry are so inconvenient to us that we're not getting our clothes washed when we need it. And staff may say, the process for checking in the laundry and for logging the different things is so time consuming that we're having a hard time doing our job duties. So maybe to have a collaborative conflict resolution style, you may have a community meeting where staff and guests present the issues that they have and work together to solve them and come up with a better solution that works for everybody. And that's an example when you have the time to do that, and you have the capacity for that. Then we have accommodating conflict resolution style. So accommodating may be used to build the relationship when the issue is relatively unimportant to you, but important to the other person. When you have less experience or expertise than the other person, or when preserving harmony and avoiding disruption are especially important. If used inappropriately, your needs are not met, and you may begin to feel taken advantage of and resentful. And an example that comes to mind may be a new staff receiving a correction or suggestion from a more experienced staff member. And it's important, for them to recognize that there's probably a reason for this correction and accepting it instead of choosing to engage in a more combative conflict around it. Then we have avoiding conflict. So this conflict resolution style is used when the issue or relationship is unimportant or to prevent immediate conflict, or when someone else can better resolve the conflict. If used inappropriately, the conflict may fester until it escalates and the relationship may remain superficial. An example I can think of maybe the shift lead, maybe you're working at all my examples are shelters this morning. So if anybody has other examples, please throw them in the chat. But an example for avoiding maybe a staff member, a person in your program has an issue that needs to be addressed by the manager, but the manager or the case manager is on their break. So as a staff member, you may say, I see that you have this issue. That makes a lot of sense that you want to talk to someone about that. We may need to table this until this person's back. In 15 or 20 minutes, they should be back. And then you've used conflict resolution style, but you've also avoided the issue because it could be addressed by someone else. These are 5 conflict resolution styles. And next we have 2 conflict resolution approaches. So the first one is the interest-based relational approach. So this approach involves various interaction techniques used to effectively resolve conflict between 2 individuals. And this one especially takes a few things into consideration. First of all, with this approach, your priority is to maintain the relationship throughout the conflict. You want to pay special attention to separating the individuals and the problem from the problem to avoid it blaming and attacking somebody. And one great way to do this is to listen first and talk second. Allow that person to have the opportunity to voice their concerns and use active listening and your different skills to better understand that person's point of view before you defend your own position. So you want to clearly identify the facts associated with the conflict, and those facts could be the background, the root causes, the individuals involved. Having a really clear idea of what the conflict is and understanding it from their point of view is super important for this approach. And lastly, explore solutions together to allow everyone to contribute to solving the problem and resolving the conflict. The key here is to respect individual differences and avoid only one fixed position. And the next approach is the win-win approach. So this conflict resolution approach changes the conflict from attack and defense to one of an opportunity for cooperation. And the basis of this approach is I want you to win, and I want you to win, and I want to win too. Did I miss anything with someone? Did someone have anything to say? Okay, cool. If anyone does, please. So the following steps can be used to kind of embody this approach when you're in a situation of conflict. First, discuss the underlying needs rather than only searching for solutions. It can be really helpful to ask questions like, what's the outcome or the result that you want? And why does that seem to be the best solution? Next, create solutions that acknowledge and value individual needs rather than deny them. I think from my experience, when I'm in the moment and I feel the need to work really fast and solve a problem quickly, I can often sacrifice individual needs or even my own needs just to make sure that the problem is solved. But once we have that understanding of the root cause of the issue, it's a lot easier it means a lot more to spend that extra amount of time to really make sure people's needs are being met with the solution at hand. Recognize individual differences in perspectives and point of views other than your own, and be willing to modify your position in light of shared information and feelings. And attack the problem, not the person, while generally maintaining a perpetual level of respect for everyone involved. Just because we're in a situation of conflict doesn't mean that we have to be opposed to each other. It just means that we have different approaches to this issue. So let's figure out how to meet in the middle, and let's figure out how to create a scenario where we can all feel like we've won. Okay, so I'm sorry this is a lot of me talking, but I appreciate everybody's time here. So now that we've talked about a few different approaches and a few different styles, depending on the scenario and depending on the specific conflict, one thing that's really important before we use these approaches and these styles, we need to be really mindful about whether or not we have a space where we could engage in a conflict resolution like this. We may want to use a win-win approach or that interest-based approach, and we want to have that like holistic experience of conflict resolution. But if the spaces that we have to engage in these styles of conflict resolution don't match up, then we may not be able to even begin the process. So this slide is talking about creating an environment for open and honest dialogue during conflict resolution. And as we go on in this training and in all of the elements of it, I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with trauma-informed care, and it's just super pervasive. And so throughout conflict resolution, so many elements of trauma-informed care support us with our ability to resolve these conflicts in ways that feel authentic and feel helpful. So first of all, to create that space, some of the things that we could consider would be confidentiality. providing a private meeting space so that we have the time and we have the focus. And so people feel like they can say what they need to say without worrying about how other people might be perceiving it who aren't directly involved in the situation. So having that private meeting space and that area for confidential conversation is super, super helpful for that. So for the conflict resolution that we may want to see in our programs or in our work or together as coworkers. We want to arrange the space so that it's conducive for conflict resolution and use a seating arrangement that conveys fairness and equality. I know something that I may think about as a staff member if I'm engaging in conflict resolution with somebody, with a coworker, say, I acknowledge that there are a lot of things that are unseen about the people that we work with, be them our coworkers, our guests, whoever it is. And there may be many types of trauma that we have all experienced. And so if I can be mindful of the seating arrangement going into the discussion, maybe the conditions for the conflict resolution will be good. So I try to make sure that I'm never blocking an exit. So especially if I'm in a supervisor position, I want to make sure that the person that I'm talking to feels like they can leave freely and accessibly if they need to. Also, I don't want to sit above anybody. I tend to like drop my wheelie chair down super, super low. It's been helpful for me before. But if we're at eye level, the success that we may have more success if we situate our spaces so that we're not two people at the head of the table looking down straight at one person. That could feel super intimidating. So the ways that we arrange our space can help us with our conflict resolution. Additionally, we want to provide resources that support problem solving, and we want to remove any objects that could be used as weapons. Especially coming from youth sheltering, whatever we can do to set people up for success is number one. So if that means that we don't have staplers on the tables, if that means that we don't have decorative items that could easily be thrown, instead we want, in the program that I'm thinking of, we would have plastic cups and we'd have slime. And if slime gets thrown at a wall, that's okay. That's a totally acceptable thing to have happen. But if something else was to happen, then that would be more of a negative consequence. So in the chat or in the discussion, does anyone else have any things that they've done that work to create a space, to create a safe space where you can engage in a conflict resolution situation?
I like to offer water or like a snack or something. Just, do you have any needs that are not being met in this moment? Because that might help.
That's awesome. Thank you. Miranda in the chat stated, I try to ask where and when the conversation occurs to ensure a sense of control. Easily accessible exits. Thank you, Samantha. Absolutely. Offering that choice, especially when it comes to the spatial element of a discussion, is so helpful. I appreciate that a lot. Awesome. If anyone has anything else, feel free to write it in the chat. Ready for the next one. So with conflict resolution, we've talked about approaches and styles and creating a safe space. And next, let's talk about ways that we can create that safe space and that opportunity through the use of making our bodies as comfortable as possible when we're engaging with folks and in these spaces of conflict resolution. I also want to acknowledge that this is a pretty cultural topic. And really depends on people's height, people's race and ethnicity, where people come from. There's so many variable factors when it comes to like the way that we hold our bodies when we're de-escalating or doing conflict resolution. I can talk about what works for me. I'm a cisgendered white woman. The way that I hold my body and I've learned to hold my body is probably going to be different depending on all of these different factors for folks. So in general, these are some things that we know to be general, but primarily what I can really speak to is what's worked for me. So I'm really hoping that we can all contribute to this too, just to enhance this part of the presentation. So to promote conflict resolution and de-escalation in our spaces, one thing is personal space, super, super important. And right now we're living in a pandemic, so we have this automatic 6 feet of social distancing. I kind of love that. Kind of wish that was the case in a lot of different spaces, because that just really emphasizes the boundary that folks have autonomy, people have agency over where their body is in time and space. And that's so important. So nobody feels like they're cornered or backed into a situation or stuck during a difficult conversation or moment. Additionally, moving slowly and deliberately. If anyone has anything to add, please do. Okay. So moving slowly and deliberately, it's important that people can predict where my body is going to be and what I'm going to do with it as much as possible. So one way that I do this, I will never approach someone from behind. If say I'm working in a program and a client has a phone call and their back is to me, I walk all the way around them so that, and not in their blind spot, but all the way around them so that I'm facing them while I come towards them, so they know where I am and where I'm going to be. But yeah, the more predictable our bodies are, the less likely we are to trigger somebody and to create a negative situation for this resolution or this de-escalation. Additionally, we want to be really conscious of our stance. If we're standing in a rigid or authoritarian way, that can convey that we want to engage in more of a power struggle situation. For me, what works best is to have a relaxed body posture. I know that fake it till you make it thing is a little cheesy, but sometimes I think about it. If I don't feel calm, if my heart's racing, if I have that adrenaline spike, if my anxiety is there because I'm walking into a tough situation, I need to work on my breathing and work on my posture. And I kind of fake it till I make it. I appear calm, even if inside I'm feeling a little bit agitated. We want to be conscious of our shoulder movements, our eye expressions, and our jaw clenching. These subtle signs of frustration, of anxiety, of annoyance. If we're exhibiting these during a conflict resolution, we're conveying to somebody that maybe we aren't as invested in this situation as we could be, or maybe we're not as willing to consider their perspective as otherwise. So making sure we're unclenching our jaws, our shoulders are relaxed. We're not, accidentally rolling our eyes or anything like that. Additionally, our hands, I think I saw someone throw this in the chat. I really appreciated that. It's important that our hands are open. We're also not in person. I'm like demonstrating it as if we are, but standing with our hands open, palms out. If I cross my hands, if I have my hands behind my back, if I have my hands in fists, if I'm holding my hands in a way where people can't tell what is in them or don't know where they're going to come at, that can be really alarming. I'm going to read a few things in the chat because this is awesome. Oh, hi, Susie. I see from Susie, discuss boundaries prior to the conversation or as the conversation's going, letting folks take turns speaking instead of over one another. Peter says, be aware of existing power dynamics and make sure to use a space that doesn't amplify that disparity, such as having guests in a staff-only area where they feel called out or isolated. Absolutely. Jen, not crossing arms or having hands on hips is always helpful. That makes a lot of sense. From Guy talks with his hands, learned how to hold them behind his back. That makes sense in certain circumstances, absolutely. Are there other things with body movements that people have found helpful when it comes to de-escalation and engaging in conflict resolution with people? Or things that haven't worked really well? Looking relaxed helps, absolutely. Great. Well, if anyone has anything else, anything they want to add, it's awesome. The more, like I said, the more we all think together, the better this is for all of us. So thank you. Danielle, I see being defensive. Is that saying that being defensive has been ineffective for you in the past? Acknowledging openly that this may be awkward or uncomfortable, and it's okay to ask for a moment to breathe or a timeout from the conversation. Awesome. Thank you, Danielle. Absolutely. Respect, eye stare, or expression. Great. Thank you all so much. So as we talked about as I talked about briefly, coming back to circle around to trauma-informed care and conflict resolution. I know this is a word that we talk about often, but for the sake of connecting conflict resolution and trauma-informed care, because they overlap so much and they're in tandem so much. One of the ways that we're considering the connection between the two for this part of the training or workshop is that with trauma-informed care, when we're implementing this approach in our programs, in our work, in our lives, especially when it comes to our programs or our work, I know at least when it comes to working in like a housing program, using trauma-informed care, our goal is to create safe havens that are free from traumatic dynamics that allow guests time and space to heal and build resiliency. We acknowledge that there's no magic word that I have, there's no magic action that I have, or like this healing element that I can do that will fix, heal, solve, or control the outcome for a guest or for another person. The only thing that's in my locus of control is if I can do everything in my power to make the space safe enough for a guest. If I can try everything in my power to reduce the traumatic dynamics, the oppressions, the systemic oppressions in our spaces, the dynamics of power and control, these different elements that contribute to the traumatic dynamics that a guest may be experiencing in their life. If we can create a space, a container in our program where those things are as limited as possible, it offers that opportunity for folks to heal themselves and build resiliency within themselves. So using strong conflict resolution skills in our spaces are key to making our programs as trauma-informed as possible. And compassion fatigue is a part of this for all of us. I know I use compassion fatigue and secondary trauma and vicarious trauma interchangeably. I think all of those terms are slightly separate. So if anyone has that information, please throw it in the chat and correct me. But with compassion fatigue and with that, when we're experiencing that secondary trauma, which comes every time we're walking anybody in our lives, anybody that we encounter through difficult, traumatic, intense, dangerous even situations and emotions, that we're humans and that places a toll on us no matter what. And conflict in general is really exhausting. Some of us may like it. I know I enjoy a debate and argument. I like that. I can get into it, but over and over again, or when there's big conflict, it's really, really tiring and it hurts after a while. So one way that we can be trauma-informed to ourselves, and one way that we can care for ourselves and do our best in these situations is to recognize our own edges and burnout level as staff members and use our coping skills and good judgment to navigate our roles in conflict resolution. Just important to touch on briefly that like we all have different triggers, we all have different edges that we come up against, especially in our work. There's certain situations that I know based on my history, based on, who I am as a person, I am not always equipped to handle in the moment. And that might be when I need to take that self-inventory, check in with my burnout level, check in with where I'm at. If I'm at a 10 in my burnout and I engage in that situation, I am going to make that conflict worse. I know that already about myself. I'm going to come in and be combative with somebody and it's not going to be helpful. So instead, I can use my coping skills to de-escalate myself first. I can ask my team if someone on my team can stand in. I can go to a supervisor or a manager, communicate my needs, and help make sure that situation gets handled in a way where I'm not putting myself in a position to escalate somebody else or even myself. I'm seeing in the chat, pay attention and make sure they can tell you, hear and understand them. Mary, let me know if my interpretation is correct, but really engaging with someone and making sure that you're paying attention to them and that you tell them that you hear what they're saying and that you are there in working to understand where they're coming from. If that's accurate, let me know, Mary, if you need me to reword that, please. Also, avoid double teaming, repeat and acknowledge what is communicated to let people know that they are heard. Oh, that's awesome. Thank you, Trish. And if I've mispronounced your name, also please let me know. Awesome. Thank you all. Ready for the next slide. Again, trauma-informed care, strength-based approach, super related to conflict resolution. It's also important to touch on that what we work towards in so much of our work and program is using that strength-based approach to emphasize that the person is not the problem is the problem. This is a person with unique gifts and strengths and different life experiences. They're encountering something and they are not the problem. There's a separate entity, there's a separate thing that we can look at that's not saying this person is not good, this person is not worthy, this person's doing things that are quote unquote bad. We have a problem, let's work on the problem, and this person is still here. It's really easy to ask what's wrong with this person, but instead we can ask what's right with this person. And that helps us separate the person from the problem. If we refocus on like, okay, what are the strengths that this person's displaying in this moment? We can reprogram ourselves from focusing solely on the issue and attributing it to who this person is. If anyone has anything they'd like to add, please let me know. Awesome. Ready for the next one. So we will we'll be doing an assertive engagement section. So we'll go through empathetic listening fairly quickly because there'll be so much opportunity to talk about this later on. When we're engaging in our conflict resolution, we want to pay attention to body language, as we've talked about, offer empathy, not sympathy, take time and be active listeners, ask for more information, repeat a phrase or a word that someone's using, allow for silences, and really refrain from solutions. And if the moment comes where a solution might be helpful, asking first if somebody would like to brainstorm solutions before we offer them. Thanks, Alexandra. So healthy conversation tips. Now that we've covered kind of the linkages with conflict resolution and values, as well as our approaches, some healthy tips for engaging in these conversations. And these have a lot to do with empathetic listening as well. First of all, reflect back on what is being said. Use their words, not yours. I remember once someone was talking to me in a program and they were escalated and upset and they're like, excuse my language, I'm really fucking pissed off right now. And I said, wow, it sounds like you're a little frustrated. That was not the right thing to say. That was really frustrating for that person and it made sense. I did not convey what they were actually saying. I simplified it, I made it littler, and it sounded patronizing the way that I approached that. So if someone's using their own words like that, reflect back what they're saying and say, yeah, it sounds like you're really upset. Sounds like you're really pissed off right now. That makes sense. So begin where they are, not where you want them to be. Be curious about and open to what they are trying to say. If I try to bring someone around to the point in the conversation I want them to be at before they're ready, if I try to control the narrative or control what they're trying to say, this won't be effective. And notice what someone is saying and what they're not saying. Sometimes I feel this is something that I'm really glad to be talking about with you all. Sometimes I forget that what's not being said could be more meaningful than what is being said, especially when it comes to looking at the root cause of an issue or how we can solve a problem together. Also, emotionally relate to how they are feeling and nurture the relationship. Next is be honest and authentic. If I am able to show up how I am and be honest about how I feel, and I think someone said in the chat, say when it's uncomfortable, say when this is a hard thing to say. If I can say that, then I'm showing up in a space in a way that's true to me, and that will, someone else will be able to see that and feel like they can show up that way as well. I really like remembering that I can say, wow, this is a really hard conversation. Wow, I'm feeling anxious while we're talking. I'm glad we're having this conversation, but this is a tough one. Just acknowledging the truth of the situation can be really effective. Take responsibility for your part in the conflict or misunderstanding. Super important. Understand how the past affects current relationships. Everything doesn't happen in a vacuum. Things are really interconnected, and there's lots of things that can come into play. And then stay with the process and the relationship. Yeah. Are there other healthy conversation tips that people feel like apply in this situation? And that's kind of a broad question, so feel free to add it to the chat. Validate people's emotions. Thank you for adding that, Sam. Absolutely. We don't have to understand. It doesn't, I think there's a quote that I like that says, what would the world be like if acceptance was not chained to understanding? We can validate somebody's genuine emotions without having to necessarily understand everything about them. Speaking to someone in private. Thank you, Trish. Awesome. From Trish, don't force an audience. It can create a feeling of being attacked. Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you said that. And we can validate and from Carrie, we can validate people even if we don't agree. Totally. Because what someone's feeling is still real, even if it's something that we're opposed to or we don't agree with. And especially forcing an audience, our best de-escalation often occurs when there is no audience, when people have the choice as to who's in the room with them while this problem's being solved. Thank you both. So just like trauma-informed care and strength-based approach, these are big topics. Cultural humility is another one. These are so interwoven in how we want to best approach our conflict and best approach our work in a situation. So this is a great video to watch that talks about cultural humility, and then we'll talk a little bit about it and how it relates to conflict in the end. Well, it is a great video for whenever you all have the time to watch it. It's pretty cool. A couple of notes from the video, since we can't watch it. There's a quote from the video that I really like. It says that cultural humility is a commitment to active engagement and critical self-reflection. So just in the smallest summary, that's really what that humility to understand that this is a lifelong process, and that when it comes to race and culture, ethnicity, religion, all of these different factors and all of these different things, none of us will ever be able to understand everything. So we want to engage in that act in critical self-reflection as we have a lifelong learning process to gain more experience, more knowledge, and more awareness. I think also, not to go too much into detail when we haven't seen the video, but there's another quote that I like that I think about when it comes to conflict resolution and cultural humility. And it's a quote about trauma, but I think it applies to conflict too. There's a quote that says, if we only address individual trauma, we're missing the main things that are perpetuating it. We're missing the main factors that are contributing to it. And that's systemic oppression, that's intergenerational trauma, that's the larger systems in our society that are perpetuating many of the forms of trauma that come up as individual traumas for folks. And I think about that with conflict resolution too. if we're only looking at the individual factors of the conflict and we're not thinking about the larger systemic inequities that are driving so many of the conditions that are creating the conflict, it's likely that we're not going to be able to really address the heart and the root and the true things that are contributing to the conflict that we're faced with right then and there. So I think also just considering when we're engaging in conflict resolution for ourselves, how could my assumptions, stereotypes, and biases be influencing my reaction to the situation? Having that self-check-in before we engage in conflict resolution, I think is really important, especially for someone with the identities that I share in a space with folks that don't, with a space with folks that are overrepresented. In many of the workspaces that we work in, people of color are overrepresented. LGBTQ plus populations are represented. That's the word. There's many different dynamics, and having that self check-in before I engage in conflict resolution is really important for me in my own process of cultural humility. And lastly, one way that we can practice this is really by giving space to share power in a conflict resolution situation. We can have the person that we're talking with, especially if it's a guest, share first what they need and what's going on for them before we share what we need and what we're seeing. That was the part with the video, but it'll come later. And again, if anyone has any other, I know we don't get to watch the video, so maybe I'll table this question and we can come back to it tomorrow. But yeah, thank you. All right, so next slide is talking about hallmarks of good conflict resolution. So just these are also questions that we can ask ourselves, our team, and the people involved once we've resolved the conflict to make sure that we are really hitting the mark, that we're really doing what we set out to do. Specifically, is the resolution fair? Is this more one-sided? Did we really accomplish something that feels fair for the people involved? Does everyone feel the resolution is reasonable? Does everyone have a stake in the resolution? I know that I've tried to solve problems before and gotten way ahead of myself and excited and just been like, okay, we'll do this, great, see you later, goodbye. And nobody's really bought in because I set the parameters, I set the tone, and I chose what was going to happen. And that was not conflict resolution. That was, and you know, that doesn't solve the issue. So making sure everyone's really bought in and has a stake in the situation. Does the resolution have a beginning and end date? I know that we've probably had experiences before at work where we voice an issue and someone says, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, we'll get right to it. But without specific parameters about when we can look for that solution and when we can look for like the completion of that action, it does not feel like a really resolved issue. So being able to provide that for folks, I think, is really helpful. Are the action steps for the resolution realistic? Can we actually do this? Did we shoot for the moon, and is it unrealistic given our time frame, our capacity, and the resources we may have at our disposal? Are the roles and responsibilities for the resolution follow through clearly defined? Have we assigned specific tasks to specific people? Do people know what they can do to make sure that this is happening? Have support and resources for the resolution been identified? And even what are the measures of successful resolution? That might be a great question to ask at the end of any situation where we're resolving a conflict. Like, how do you feel like this will be resolved? What does it mean to you for the situation to be sorted? Cool. Thank you, Alexander. All right, if anybody needs to stand up and stretch, feel free. A lot of talking. I appreciate everyone's patience. You can give ourselves a couple of minutes maybe just to get a chance to move before we go into a brief part that will talk about emotional regulation and anger. And I see from Lamika the question, will we get copies of this PowerPoint? Yes, we will.
Yes, and forgive me, I'm not trying to do too much on my computer just in case it slows down. But I'm going to give all the links, all the copies. I'll make sure it's pretty packaged together, easily accessible. I'll make sure it's accessible to everyone. And yes, thank you for your patience, y'all. I really appreciate it.
You're doing great. All right. I have a few things left to cover before sort of some general questions for everybody, just a couple of general questions. So if people are ready, we can go into emotional regulation. So one thing to think about with conflict, anger is a part of conflict. Anger is also a natural part of life. It's a good thing. It's a bad thing. It just really, if we ignore our anger, we're not doing a service to ourselves or others. And it's important to acknowledge that and to think about what this actually is, because we're going to encounter it, especially when we work through these approaches or work through these different steps with people. So first of all, there's an anger arousal cycle that can be helpful to know. It can be helpful to, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. So it can be helpful to have this kind of blueprint for what happens, what can happen, especially when we're working maybe with a guest who's having a really tough day or tough moment. Understanding the cycle can help us understand our own reactions and the reactions of others. So first of all, we have the trigger phase. And this is an event that starts the anger cycle. We can get into an argument or receive some information that shocks us or annoys us, or feedback that's really hard for us to process, or a rule that we don't feel like is fair or just. And we may feel threatened, and then our bodies will prepare to meet that threat when we get into that trigger. So at the escalation phase, our body prepares for a crisis. And our body does this really physiologically. And sometimes I know for myself, sometimes I don't know my body's actually doing that. So my respiration may increase, my breathing patterns will increase, and my heart rate will go up. There'll be a rise in my blood pressure. Muscles will tense for action. My voice will become louder or alters in pitch. Even our pupils become larger. Our body stance may change as well. And so next time we feel angry, it may be really helpful, at least for myself, to take note of these things and to recognize how my body changes as we're going about these certain scenarios, as we go about these certain triggers. So next is the crisis phase. And this is when our survival instinct kicks into that flight, fight, freeze, or fawn response. Our body prepares to take action. And during this phase, the quality of our judgment is significantly reduced, and decisions may be made without the benefit of our best reasoning. Our bodies have gone into survival mode, and our blood flow and our adrenaline is pumping. And so the blood that would go to our brains to especially for those cognitive processes that involve like high level reasoning and sound judgment and critical thought, we've diverted that blood flow, and now our body is ready for action and ready to respond. So our reptilian brain is taking charge, and it's hard for us to have good judgment in those moments. Like physiologically, it's hard. So next we have the recovery phase. And so I guess also with the crisis phase, I think this is something that probably everyone in this room often thinks about, but it probably bears repeating, at least for myself. If I'm engaging with somebody who's in that crisis phase, and if I'm trying to resolve that conflict or de-escalate somebody and they're in that phase already, it is not going to be helpful. They're not going to be able to process. They're not going to be able to have that reasonable conversation. They're not going to be able to come down from that. And so instead, that's more, we're going to do more of like a safety de-escalation process, more coping skills, more calm breathing, more centering and grounding. It's not going to be that like logical problem solving moment. I see from Susie, emotional regulation and coping skills can be found in dialectical behavioral therapy, found to be helpful for some folks with behavioral disorders and addiction recovery. Free workbook online. Absolutely. DBT is awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Susie. If you want to, feel free to drop the link too. So next is the recovery phase. So this happens after the action of the crisis phase has passed. Sorry, if anybody wants to add anything, feel free. Okay. So in the recovery phase, the body begins to recover from the extreme stress and expenditure of energy. The adrenaline in our blood gradually dissipates. Our quality of judgment returns as our analytical reasoning replaces the survival response. So we start to come back online. We start to be able to make those decisions that maybe we weren't able to make at first. And then we have the post-crisis depression phase. And this is the part where the heart rate slips below normal so that the body can regulate and regain its balance. Energy and awareness returns to allow us to assess what just happened. Folks may feel the feeling of guilt or regret or emotional depression, especially if we lost control over our judgment and made unhealthy decisions in any of the previous phases. I know that sometimes that might be a feeling of shame, or that might be a feeling of even embarrassment that, this occurred and we weren't fully in the driver's seat for that moment. Oh, thank you, Susie. That's awesome. If anyone has anything else to add that about the anger arousal cycle, please feel free. Cool. We can move on to the next one. So keeping that in mind, keeping that physiological process that our bodies respond to anger with, and how it affects our brain and our judgment and our ability to process information. This is just a brief part about responding to an angry coworker. Again, this is a situation that is going to be a part of working on a team. And it again, like conflict resolution can be an opportunity to strengthen a relationship with somebody. So if we think about responding to an angry coworker, we want to identify where someone is at with that anger arousal cycle. If the person is already at the crisis phase, again, their ability to think rationally will be impaired. We want to consider whether it would be best to delay the discussion until the individual is calmer. And so especially deciding whether to engage or not. We absolutely can say, I can't discuss this right now. Can we meet later? That might be the best response. And if you decide that you two can manage the discussion, here are some following tips for what we can do. So first of all, acknowledge/validate the anger. I know people have talked about this already in the chat, which was great. We can validate, even if we don't agree with it, even if we don't understand it, we can still validate the fact that somebody is genuinely angry right now. Acknowledge that the other person is angry. Ask them to tell you what caused the anger and listen carefully without interruption until the other party is vented. Something that Alexandra shared with me that I keep in mind now is it's really helpful to ask what happened rather than what is wrong. So we can ask somebody what happened to cause this anger, instead of what's wrong, what's the big problem. Remain calm. Do not react if the person is verbally abusive or accusatory. Remaining calm is the best way to support and encourage the other individual to calm down. If we meet somebody with the same level of anger, the situation can just continue to escalate. If we can remain calm, even if we're faking it, even if we're not feeling calm, even if we're really, really upset and frustrated, we'll be able to work through this situation better. Ask about the problem and tentatively about solutions. Again, asking what's happened rather than what's wrong. And then don't continue if the anger continues, especially if the anger is building. If the individual does not calm down, in a calm demeanor, we can again suggest that we handle this at a different time. We don't have to remain in a situation when another individual is yelling, calling us names, or threatening us. And often that may require the intervention of a supervisor or a teammate. And again, request help as needed. There's no wrong door policy for asking for help. Are there other things that people have found helpful when responding to somebody who's angry with you, whether it's a coworker or somebody else? If there are, feel free to drop them in the chat. And again, just as important as responding to someone who's angry is managing our own anger in situations. I know for me, I have a short temper and I can have a short fuse. And it's something that like personally I've had to really work on, especially in the work that I really care about. So some ways to manage your own anger. Delay the discussion until you're calmer. It's probably the most helpful one for me. I tend to love to get into a big debate or figure out who's right and who's wrong, and it's just not helpful. It isn't. So over time, I've learned how to delay the discussion until I'm in a calm state. I'm willing to consider other perspectives, and I'm willing to really invest in problem solving rather than just like that, like who's right, who's wrong dynamic. I see from Richard, it may be hard, but put yourself in their shoes. Yes, I love that. That's such a good point to practice that before you even engage in the conversation, to try your best beforehand to reprogram where you're coming from and try to put yourself where they're coming from. I also see from Sifanesha, I'm so sorry, I may have mispronounced that. Walk away from the conflict before it gets bigger. Yes, absolutely. So helpful. Absolutely. We all have the choice. We all have the option to walk away. And especially if that's going to be more helpful in the long run, 100%. And for Mary, staying calm and respectful. Totally. Thank you all. From Jen, opportunity to learn, positive reframing if possible. Totally. So when it comes to managing our anger, using all of these suggestions, take steps to actively reduce stress. For me, that's deep breathing. For me, that's taking a walk. For me, that's calling a friend for a distraction, not just to vent, but just to get my mind into a different place, to talk to them about something else, helps me kind of regulate myself. Whatever we can do to work on our own self-regulation, because we can't engage with somebody if we're not regulating ourselves. Analyze the source of your anger. Ask yourself why the situation has triggered such a strong reaction. Sometimes we are responding to a genuine trigger that we have that we weren't aware of. And maybe the situation is not what we think it is. Maybe it totally is, but sometimes it may be more of a reaction rather than a response to something. Identify the source of conflict and the goal of your dialogue. I really like that. Asking myself what started the conflict and why, and what is it that I want the other person to do or not to do. Thinking about this when I am working in a supervisory role and I may be taking on-call calls from staff for emergencies that come up throughout the night. Generally, what I'm asking from staff is that they call me with a proposed solution before they call me to just tell me that there's an issue. And if I'm telling staff that, I want to make sure that I'm practicing that as well. So if I'm about to engage in a conflict resolution situation and I'm really upset and angry with somebody, it's really important to me to approach that situation with a goal in mind of how to resolve that conflict, being flexible with it for sure, but not just approaching it as an opportunity to vent my frustrations and tell them why this is a problem, but also coming into it with an option for resolution. Manage your self-talk. Often, the way that we talk to ourselves is absolutely connected to our emotional state. I think, especially, and sometimes if we change our self-talk, we'll change how we feel. And sometimes we won't, but it can be a helpful tool for us when it comes to managing our anger. What is the story that we're telling ourselves in our head? Is it accurate? Is there a way to change it? And begin that process of more emotional regulation. And then take steps to solve the problem. Does anyone else have techniques that they've used? I see some from Rob Stewart. One challenge I have in situations where there is a lot of anger going around, but walking away isn't really an option. I.e., there's a situation among clients that's escalating and can't really wait until later. Definitely, yes. I've experienced that challenge too. And that for me, I guess, is when I tend to use the more of like a fake it till I make it approach, where I know that there's no other option. I can't walk away. This has to be addressed now. I'm escalated. I'm frustrated. And then I have to take a quick inventory and I have to use the quickest skills I can to at least calm my body, if not my mind, before moving to engage. And I'm wondering what other people have done in those situations that's been effective. I also know in situations like that, when you don't have an option and you have to engage in de-escalation and there's a lot of upset and frustration, I really focus on separating folks. If I'll have a better chance, if I'm feeling escalated and angry in that situation, but I have to move towards de-escalation, it'll be a lot. I know I'll be more successful, and hopefully someone else will be more successful if my main focus is solely on separating folks, not solving the problem in the moment, not making things completely deflated or not angry, but really just breaking it down to like this one thing that is tangible could just be to separate folks and then to work from there. I see from Stefanesh, by walking away, you can reach out to coworkers to take over. Absolutely. Going outside to walk and talk, as mentioned, seems useful at times. Totally. Yeah, I appreciate walking away so you can reach out to coworkers to take over sometimes if that's an option. Absolutely. Great. If anyone else has anything, please feel free. Mary, talking to someone else for support. We need to be able to vent as well. All the stuff we take in on the daily, sometimes we need to vent. Totally. And also, like, sometimes if we don't get that opportunity to vent a little bit with our coworkers, we hang on to that when we go home, and that can affect us as well. So finding that trusted support person. You're good. Great. If anyone else especially has anything, especially for the challenge that Rob mentioned, feel free to write it in. What if you do not have support if you are alone? That's a great question. Bali, is this in reference to if you're entering a de-escalation situation and you don't have the support of your team, or if you're wanting to vent or wanting to express that frustration and you don't have anyone where you can share that? Yeah, I hear two things with that question, and I just want to make sure that I'm accurate with what you're talking about. The first thing I hear is like, how do you handle a situation with that guest where you don't have the support, but the situation's continuing? And then also, what do you do in the aftermath when there's no one there to support you, but you're still experiencing it? Is that accurate?
Correct.
Cool. I'm curious for everyone in the room suggestions.
What I've done is that I've asked everybody just to let's calm down and let's give each one of us time to speak so we can respect, give each other the respect. And usually I think words are important when they're arguing, so, because everybody want to be respected. So, and that's been successful for me, quite a bit. Is like, hey, let's start all over. I'm gonna let you speak first. You tell me how you feel. And then after we allow that person to let the other person speak, and then me as the middle person, let me tell you how I feel. And then and again, that tone definitely makes a difference. And I do use the word respect quite a bit, because like I said, everybody wants to be respected, and they also want to be heard, and I also reiterate that, because if everybody's talking, you're not going to get anywhere, and nobody's going to hear how you feel. Feeling is a good word too. That's it.
Thank you. That was so helpful. I really like what you said about giving people a chance to start all over as well. And like starting all over while recentering. This is not, we all want to be respected. Let's start over and try this again. From Billy, I agree. Allowing participants the ability to voice their side and respect is so important. To come back to the one thing that came to mind for that question was also like, if we're in that situation with we don't have support and someone's continuing to escalate, the thing that comes to mind for me is just really breaking it down to the bare minimum. What is the most important thing that has to happen in this situation? Because I don't have the capacity for a full solution to go the full distance. And often that's safety. What can I do in this moment to make sure that that if we can't resolve the conflict, at least we can resolve as many safety concerns as possible in this exact moment.
Exactly.
And also giving ourselves grace. And if we can at least take every step that we have in our agency, our policy, and our own de-escalation practices to work towards safety, it's okay if we're not perfect in that moment and we don't always have the capacity for everything. Does anyone else have other things that they'd add for this part of our conversation? Cool. Thank you all so much. So we're getting down to the very end of our time talking about conflict resolution. We did talk about earlier some questions to ask ourselves after we've resolved the conflict to make sure that we've met all the steps that we need. But so we're going a little bit back in time, and we're going to talk about ground rules during conflict resolution discussions. So some ground rules for us to keep in mind that we've talked about and that people have mentioned: remaining calm. If we can keep our calm, if we can keep our cool, most likely that will be the best tool we have to help other people do the same. One person speaking at a time, like Danielle talked about, really encouraging that we're here, just like Danielle said, we're here to listen to each other. We're here to give people an opportunity to be heard and understood, and we can't do that if we're talking over each other. Be specific about what's bothering you and deal with one issue at a time. I know for me, my brain can move faster than it should sometimes, and I'll want to solve 3 issues at once and get into all these different things. It's not helpful. If we can simplify what we're doing, saves time, saves energy. Also, it's calming and more grounding for other people and gives us a better opportunity to really solve one conflict at a time. Avoid accusations and blaming. Absolutely. Again, this comes into separating the person from the problem. We have an issue at hand, and we don't need to get into the blaming and the name calling and any of the other things that are more directed at who that person is versus what the problem is. And then also avoid generalizing. I know this comes back to nonviolent communication as well. This is really about how we feel, how it's affecting us in the moment. It doesn't mean that because this happened once, it's going to happen all the time. It's going to happen again. It's going to happen to everybody. This is really just focusing on what we have right here and right now. Oh, I like that. Also from Danielle, we can sometimes use a coin and the person with the coin speaks. Awesome. That's really cool. I like having that physical object where people can tangibly know who's talking next and can grab it and create a little bit of space too. That's really cool. Thank you. And then also avoid shutting down. I know this is also a natural reaction to conflict, and this is like part of our fight, flight, freeze response, fawn feelings. Like we may be more inclined to shut down and to tune out, and we can't handle it in this moment. So again, really concentrating on how we're regulating our bodies, keeping that focus and that goal in mind of why we want to resolve this conflict in the first place. Why is it important to work towards not shutting down and to continue engaging? Are there other ground rules for conflict resolution that have worked well for you all? Well, if there are, again, please add them to the chat. This chat is awesome so far. Ready for the last one, Alexandra? Lastly, touching on active listening. I see from Susie, checking in on yourself before handling others' conflicts. 100%. Classic airplane example. If we don't have our breathing apparatus on, we can't do that. We can't put it on for someone else. Thank you. So active listening, what to do. So use I statements. And this is really, again, this is so related to nonviolent communication, which I think we'll get to touch on a little bit later. as the training goes on. So use I statements, specifically the way I see it, the way I experienced it, I'm feeling. Again, that really helps us not generalize too and not make assumptions with the way that we're communicating. Encourage individuals to share their issues. I want to understand what has upset you. I want to understand what has happened. Do you feel comfortable sharing that with me? Clarify the real issue rather than making assumptions. Please tell me more about this. What I'm hearing you say is this. Is this accurate? Does this fit for you? Whatever questions we can ask to convey to someone else that we care about what they're saying, we want to know, and that help us get to that root cause and fully understand something that maybe we're unsure about, maybe we're wanting to guess on. If we check ourselves before we guess or make an assumption and we ask a question instead, that could help us in the situation. Restate what you heard. It sounds like you weren't expecting that to happen. It sounds like this caught you off guard. It sounds like you wanted one thing to happen and somebody did another thing, and that felt really unfair for you, or that felt like you were disregarded. Whatever we can do to use the person's own words, but also reframe it so they understand that we're listening and we want to make sure we understand. And then validate the concerns of the individual. I can imagine how upsetting that must have been. And again, I'm sure for all of us in this room too, this is something that we keep in mind. For myself, I can't tell you the times that I've made the mistake of saying, wow, I understand how that must feel. I get what you're talking about. I know what you're going through. I just don't. Over and over again, I don't. Even if I've been through a similar situation, I don't have that person's life experience, history, context. I'll never understand exactly how that moment really feels for somebody. So I need to say, like, I imagine how, if I was in that situation, I would be feeling upset. Whatever I can do to make sure I'm not just saying, yeah, I get it. I totally understand this, because that's also dismissive for somebody. And I also see from Billy, in our trauma training, they told us to recognize what triggers are, because then we can see if we are reacting or responding. Absolutely. Again, we all have our own sets of triggers, and when we can recognize when they're coming up and catch our edges before we're reacting to a situation, rather than having that ability to calmly and succinctly use our critical thought and respond to something. And if there's more you'd like to add to that, Billy, please feel free to jump in. Awesome. Are there other practices for active listening or engaging in conversations that people have found helpful? Great. Well, again, if there are, please feel free to add them to the chat.